Hello, everyone. Sorry, I had this on my schedule at 5:10, but glad I came early. And I want to talk about, what I think are some of the biggest questions in economics, and a little bit about what bugs me about some of the ways people think about it, some of the consequences of why it bugs me that they think about it that way, and then sort of a plea for a better way to think about it. So that's what I want to talk about now. Overarching, the big challenge for me in the economy, the number one challenge, but not the only one, is the slowdown in the growth rate for median households. So now I'm talking about the United States. From 1948 to 1973, the typical household saw its income rise by 3% a year. When incomes rise at 3% a year, they double roughly every 20-something years. So every generation can expect to have an income twice as high as the previous. Since 1973, for the typical, it's actually family, not household, for the typical family, income growth has slowed to about 0.6% a year. At about 0.6% a year, it takes a century for incomes to double instead of a generation. For many households, they don't see their children's income rise relative to their parents. And all of this, I think, is not just an economic problem, but it's probably spilled over and a cause of some of the political issues that we face. When I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, I was curious as to just a pure accounting decomposition of what went into this income slowdown. And when I sort of set out how to think about that accounting decomposition, I actually didn't know the answer. And if anything, I actually suspected that inequality was the big thing that was going on. But decided we would just do a back-of-the-envelope exercise with a counterfactual. The first counterfactual would be, what if after 1973, inequality continued to rise as it rose, rise that took us from the bottom 90% getting about half of the income, I'm getting about 2/3 of the income to about half of the income. What if that rise had happened, but we then, in the counterfactual, didn't ever have a productivity slowdown? So productivity in that earlier period had been growing at about 2.8% a year, in that later period growing at about 1.8% a year. Where would incomes be today? The answer was that incomes would be about 74% higher in 2019. That's $63,000 a year. Then did the same exercise but reversed it. The productivity slowdown happened. The increase in inequality didn't. So the middle class, broadly defined as the bottom 90% of households, got to keep the same share of income. They got to have 2/3 of the income, just of the smaller pie, because the productivity slowdown actually happened. In that case, incomes would have only been 16% higher, or $14,000. So overwhelmingly in this counterfactual, it loaded on productivity, and Glenn has cited, I think, this a number of times. Frankly, doing that focused my mind a little bit more. I always, I had read Paul Krugman's The Age of Diminished Expectations when it came out, and the famous line, productivity isn't everything, but it's nearly everything in the long run. I'd sort of internalized that, but partly forgot it. And then reminding myself of this reminded me just how incredibly powerful that force of compounding is around productivity growth. Of course, this type of accounting exercise or accounting decomposition doesn't really answer any policy-related question. Moreover, the incomes of the middle class, the aggregate incomes, the income of the median, aren't the only objectives we have in terms of economic policy. We care about many other things that may not even show up in that decomposition. We care about climate change. We care about health and mortality and longevity. We care about racial justice and gender justice. We care about lives in the context of a pandemic. We care about many, many other things that don't show up in that decomposition. So we want to think about all of those things, and we want to think about productivity, and we want to think about inequality. And here's where my pet peeve comes in. I'm going to be grossly unfair to both liberals and to conservatives. I'm going to also be grossly unfair and implying a sort of plague on both your houses, that they're equal. But the liberal tendency and the liberal error, I think, is sometimes to think that all good things go together, to not really acknowledge the existence of trade-offs, to say anything we do for growth is going to help inequality, anything we do for inequality is going to help growth. By tackling climate change, we're going to create jobs. By saving lives in the pandemic, we're also going to save and help the economy. That all of these different goals basically go together. Now, sometimes that's true. The dismal science has probably maybe been a little bit overly dismal at times. There's all sorts of opportunities. For example, I think to take the pandemic, which I think was a good way to think about this, in March of 2020, there probably was no trade-off. If you kept your state open, you probably would have had a pandemic that would rip through it, would have overwhelmed the hospitals, and you wouldn't have been able to have an economy in your state a couple months later. By 2021, though, that probably wasn't the case anymore. At that point, there probably really was a trade-off between lives and the economy. Red states made one trade-off and ended up with higher mortality, lower unemployment, and faster economic growth. Blue states made a different trade-off. And just think about it. There's certain things where it's obvious. For example, we could have shut every outdoor construction site in the country in 2020, 2021, and could still keep them closed today. If we had shut every outdoor construction site, we probably would have saved a few lives. There's a little bit of COVID being spread. You go inside for your coffee or meal break and the like. But that would have had a very, very high economic cost. A cost in terms of jobs, GDP and the like, and probably one that wouldn't pass most of our cost-benefit tests. At the other end of the spectrum, there's things like vaccinations that probably do have the win-win property that they both help the economy and save lives, and you get more of all the good things. So the progressive vice, I think, is thinking that everything is like a vaccine and nothing is like shutting an outdoor construction site, and that all good things go together, and you can be sort of happy about all of it. What are the consequences of that? If it's well-intentioned and the policies are good and it's a nice idea and it's going to help people, why not just sort of fudge a little bit and ignore the downsides or the costs or the trade-offs and talk about everything that's being good together? Well, I think there are a few downsides. One downside is you'll end up having something that has a trade-off that you rule out. If you do your analysis correctly and you limit yourselves to things that only increase growth while reducing inequality, you're going to have too small a set of policies. You're going to rule out things that have a huge effect on growth with a little cost for inequality. And conversely, you're going to rule out things that dramatically reduce inequality at only a tiny cost to growth. I'm more worried, though, that you're not going to do the analysis right and rule things out, but you're going to do the analysis wrong, and maybe you're going to do something that hurts some people in the process of trying to help others. In my view, for example, the portion of the student loan debt relief that does not go to Pell Grant students is almost unambiguously going to make everyone that doesn't get it worse off. Either a little bit of higher inflation now, or higher interest rates to combat that inflation, higher inflation in the future, or future tax increases or benefit cuts to pay back the cost of that. What might that mean? That in the process of helping someone for the non-Pell portion of the student loan debt relief, you're talking about a group that primarily, in that case, actually is relatively high income. You're giving them money. You're taking money away from someone who's low income, and you're unintentionally hurting a set of people in the process of trying to help some others. Finally, the third thing I worry about when you don't think hard and take trade-offs seriously is that you may not even be able to get things done. Because you can go out and say, and I've been in government where colleagues of mine were proposing some huge regulation on a business, and a colleague of mine would say it's great for the business is going to love it. We'd make the announcement, their stock price would go down 5%. And I'd say, that doesn't mean it was a bad idea. It might actually have been a good idea. It might be worth doing. I don't care about that company's stock price. I care about social welfare. But you told me that company would be happy. I sort of trust their shareholders' assessment of its impact on the net present value of your earnings more than I trust yours. Why is that relevant? Because often the people that lose from a policy, sometimes they don't know. I think a lot of the people that will lose from the upper end of the student loan interest, the student loan forgiveness, won't actually realize they lost as a result of it. In many cases, the people that lose from a policy do know. And if you kid yourself that there's no trade-offs, that there's no losers, you're not going to be prepared to do what you need to. Maybe it might be some form of compensation or redistribution to make your policy a compensated Pareto improvement if it genuinely was efficient. It might be some targeted buying off of the losers, not for some social welfare reason, but just so it can happen, something that when you do climate change policy, I think you actually do need to take seriously that political economy aspect. And if you've fooled yourself into thinking there are no losers, you can end up not getting something done because the losers might be smarter than you are. So now let me talk about the conservative vice. The conservative vice isn't about getting the signs wrong, it's about getting the magnitudes wrong. It's about taking a policy that might have, for example, a small negative impact on growth and arguing that it has a very large impact on growth. When you get the magnitudes wrong, that tends to make you lexicographic about whatever is going to help economic growth. You're going to want to do that no matter what the costs in terms of inequality, poverty, climate change, lives, and the like. There's an old saying, and it's certainly, and none of this is about you, Glenn, and none of this is about me, but I think we both know some people that this might be not totally unfair about, that there's no problem with supply-side economics that can't be solved by dividing by 10. And you see this all the time, sort of overheated rhetoric. The top tax rate. President Biden has proposed raising it to 39.6. I happen to like that as an idea. I respect someone if they don't like that as an idea. If someone tells me that's going to crush the economy, destroy jobs, bring about a recession, I think I've probably lost my respect for them because they're making an empirical claim that is extremely unlikely to be true, and an empirical claim that we actually saw quite a lot when President Clinton raised taxes to that rate in 1993, that the sky would fall, and the sky never fell. In fact, it shone quite brightly. Maybe it would have shone a tiny bit more brightly without that, maybe a tiny bit less. But I think that magnitude gets you to a place where when you're doing your regulatory analysis, for example, instead of doing what you should do and do cost-benefit analysis, you do cost analysis. And all regulations are a cost, and you add up the total cost of the regulations, you lament the total cost of the regulations, and you try to minimize the total cost of the regulations regardless of what other purpose they're serving in terms of dealing with whatever one of those other goals you might have, saving lives, saving the climate, and the like. Needless to say, not everyone falls into the first sin. Not every liberal falls into the sin of thinking all good things always go together and there's never any trade-offs. Not everyone falls into the sin on the conservative side of everything's 10 times as large as it actually is. But my perception is that the public policy debate, the way public policy is being formed, the debate that happens outside of rooms like this, outside of universities like this, increasingly has those two tendencies in it. So what's the solution to that? I think the solution to that is, and this is the best I have, and I don't think it's quite good enough as a solution, but I'll still keep trying, is better economic analysis and taking your economic analysis seriously. Thinking hard about costs and benefits, thinking hard about trade-offs, which trade-offs are worth it, vaccination, which trade-offs are probably not worth it, shutting down outdoor construction sites, which fall in between mask mandates at some point in the middle of 2021. And that's sometimes called, on the left, referred to sort of derisively as neoliberalism. I'm sure there's some derisive term for that on the right as well, but I do think that there's no way to get yourself out of thinking hard about budget constraints, thinking hard about benefits, thinking hard about cost, and in a lot of the different little policy examples I've sprinkled throughout here, doing that might have made somewhat more of a difference. Going forward, what does this motivate us to do? Well, the first thing is trying to find everything that falls into the set of all good things go together. When it comes to climate change and the economy, I think there isn't a whole lot in that set, frankly. Some things like reminding people to turn down the heat or raise the to turn down the heat or turn down the air conditioning might save families money and save climate change. There's some evidence of that, but the magnitude is relatively small. And those types of nudges actually aren't costless. They save families money, but the evidence is it does quite irritate people. And so their overall utility may or may not go up, even if their utility bills go down. A lot of other things. The Inflation Reduction Act, I'm a big supporter of it. I think it did the right things. I think it did things on climate change that are much better than doing nothing on climate change, but requires raising taxes in a distortionary manner, which has some downside. It has a set of industrial policies built into it that probably were needed to buy off key constituencies, but it's important to be eyes wide open that you're not going to help deal with climate change anymore cost effectively if you insist on making everything or more in the United States than if you buy it from the cheapest and most efficient producer around the world. You're probably not going to help the US economy either by putting a big thumb on the scale for one form of production as opposed to other forms of production. I think with growth and inequality, there probably is a slightly longer menu of things that are complementary in addressing both growth and inequality. Education is one of the most, one hesitates to just repeat it, but it's such a powerful force, both for growth and for inequality, as well as for a third factor that I didn't have time to talk about today, which is labor force participation. Certain investments in research, infrastructure, and the like probably are good for both, but not definitely. If your sole goal is to make progress in the life sciences, and here I'm going to show my nativist bias. I used to be a New Yorker, but I pretend I never lived here now, and that I've been in Cambridge my whole life. You'd probably want to give most of your money to the Boston area. You're going to make more progress on solving cancer, on solving Alzheimer's, on solving heart disease by taking advantage of the enormous spillovers that you have in an area like that. It's not obvious to me whether you're going to reduce or increase inequality in the process, but I think most of us, when it comes to Alzheimer's or cancer research, probably don't want to sacrifice a lot of the potential gains that we'd get in order to spread the money around to disadvantaged institutions that probably aren't going to do as good a job solving this set of problems. Then you get to the policies where there may be some mild form of trade-off. Immigration, I think, is the most powerful growth policy that we have. It's the most powerful, may even be the most powerful innovation policy we have. Most of that, the innovation part, is on high-skilled immigration, but giving a pathway to citizenship for people here reduces the uncertainty they face, allows them to do more to invest in businesses, invest in education, match themselves with the job that they're most productive and can contribute the most in. Inequality at the worldwide level, immigration at the worldwide level is dramatically inequality reducing. You take people from poor countries and dramatically raise their incomes. If you measure the impact it has on inequality for the world as a whole, letting people move to the United States reduces it. Within the United States, I'm not sure. There's a set of dueling results that with economists like George Borjas on one side and David Card on the other, who have battled for decades. I certainly think there have to be some cases in some places where increased immigration can lead to greater inequality. In fact, we've seen that when Russian mathematicians were allowed to immigrate to the United States. It made American mathematicians worse off, even if it made American mathematics and the mathematics done in the United States much, much better, and was worth it as a result. That means, though, that when you do that immigration policy, maybe you want to think about the sentence that we often say with trade. You want to expand trade, but make sure you're compensating the losers, making sure you're bringing everyone along. But you want to do that same thing and take that seriously in the same way with immigration policy. I don't want to do a bullet point list of every single policy in my agenda, but I'll say there's ones on the other side too. Increasing the minimum wage, certainly a modest increase in the minimum wage. I'm not convinced that that would, increase employment. I think it probably would slightly reduce it. I think it has some trade-offs in terms of, for example, reduced benefits that you might get as a result of a higher minimum wage. But on balance, to me, that passes a cost-benefit test and is one of the only tools we really have to raise market wages for people at the bottom and to do it relatively quickly, as opposed to education, which takes a while. If we had the type of dynamic, competitive, innovative economy I would love to see, there's no reason to think it would generate the types of gains and spread those gains as broadly as what I would like to see. So the flip side of having a more market-oriented economy, a more dynamic economy, a more competitive economy, would be some more redistribution as well. In some cases, maybe that redistribution might be win-win. There are papers about giving money to children means when those children grow up, they they earn more, they're more likely to work, less likely to be in prison, and the like. But some of that redistribution probably has a trade-off. And in fact, if you have two objectives, and you're not doing something that has a trade-off, then you're doing too little. If all you do on climate change, if all you do to save lives in the pandemic, if all you do on inequality is things that also increase growth, in every one of those cases you're doing too little. Because you want to do everything that does both, and then you want to add those extra things that help enough with one that it makes up for the harm to the other. The last thing I'd want to say in conclusion is I'm trying to just sort of talk about a way of thinking. In some ways I think it's quite obvious, and anyone that's taken an economics class I think would sort of in principle agree with everything I just said. But look around the world and ask yourself, to what degree do you think policymakers are actually taking all of that to heart, thinking seriously about it? In what ways could you get them to think seriously about it? In what places would it change what you support, change how you talk about it, change how you do it? Because I am genuinely worried that we're foregoing an awful lot of opportunities, in some case opportunities with a small cost that some conservative blocks because they think that cost is much bigger than it is. In some case, some opportunity that entailed a trade-off that a progressive didn't want to compensate people from the trade-off, ended up hurting them or making things worse as a result. And so, my conclusion to all of this is there are a lot of opportunities for policy. I think some of them might even be bipartisan. A lot of them are really old ideas like education. Some of them are old ideas that have gotten a new lease on life, like making an economy more competitive by reducing occupational licensing, reducing land use restrictions, and enabling people to move more from place to place. But in all of those cases, that same type of analysis is really important. If you look at the slowdown in income growth, it really does have a lot of causes. Productivity inequality is smaller, but it's still an important cause. It's not going to have any one solution. We're going to need an all-of-the-above solution to restore income growths, and even more to do it while achieving our many other goals. But to sort through, when you have those multiple objectives, when you have those multiple instruments, is precisely when sort of technocratic exercise of writing down the policies, writing down the budget constraint, working through the model, and deciding what things to include in that strategy becomes so especially important. Thank you. So I don't know if you do questions or what you do.
We have time for one or two. Yeah, I'm back here with the mic here.
Hey, Jason. On your point about the fact that the liberals don't acknowledge trade-offs, everything you talked about was micro. On the macroeconomic scale, the big issue you've been talking a lot about is how to conquer inflation, and you've been pretty hawkish on that, I would say. The counter-argument would be that, and the argument is, there's no trade-off, because if we raise interest rates a lot, we will eventually create the conditions for strong growth. That Jay Powell keeps making that point. The other argument is, no, there is a trade-off. You're going to cause lasting damage to the economy, hysteresis effects, people will lose skills, and so on. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so first of all, I used to aspire to be an interesting, broad-minded person who thought about a range of topics, and for the last year and a half, I've gotten stuck in inflation, and I thought I'd try to at least return to a small glimmer of my old self with this talk, and you've now ruined that. I think inflation would be a perfect example of what I'm talking about. First of all, there really are people out there saying if you raise interest rates, that's going to hurt the economy and raise inflation. I mean, that's sort of nuts. But that would be this all good things go together attitude. There's this idea that if you just fix the supply side of the economy, you'll bring down inflation and create jobs. And people talk about, zoning is a reason house prices are really high. Of course it is. Are you going to get, though, 50 states and thousands of jurisdictions around the country to reform their zoning rules in the next 3 months and have that go into effect and transform our housing sector in the next year or two? That's just preposterous. In terms of the specific trade-off you talked about, I think once you think about this as a trade-off between not unemployment and inflation, but unemployment and rising inflation, an idea that Ned, just repeating things from 50 years ago, becomes quite different, first of all, and then makes you think about, is it a smaller recession today versus a larger recession tomorrow? So if you're worried about hysteresis and all you care about is jobs, you don't even care about inflation, I think you'd still probably want to be more aggressive now rather than do less now and have to do more later. By the way, I think I'm dovish on monetary policy because I've underestimated inflation and underestimated how much the Fed needed to do, but maybe less dovish than some. Oh, yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Ishfaq. I'm a student of School of International and Public Affairs. You talked about solutions, which you said that there are old ones like education. So what do you think are the major barriers for these ideas to be successful in the long term?
Yeah. So first of all, education is easy to talk about. There's some aspects where I think we do need more money. We don't spend a lot on preschool. I think it's hard to solve our preschool without having preschools that look more like the ones my children went to, which have teachers who are trained in relatively small class sizes. For K through 12, I think we can make an awful lot of progress without more money, but with, for example, more ability to fire teachers, or less tenure instantly, or higher pay up front and smaller pensions later, so it's sort of a higher, flatter pay scale rather than the pay scale you have now. Those types of ideas for K through 12, of course, are enormously controversial and don't make every single person in the country better off, just every student in the country better off.
All right, we have one more over here.
So, thanks for your talk. I fear I might succumb to the liberal vice, so please tell me why I'm wrong about how fighting inequality and raising productivity can go together. We have the growth of the financial sector in America and the entrenched ethic of shareholder first seems to me to have had a huge impact in terms of everything geared toward raising stock prices, which means boosting profits, which means cutting costs, the whole M&A private equity phenomenon. Labor cost, labor is cut, the cost of labor is cut. It seems to me that affects productivity, less investment in research and development. So I see the rise, the financialization of the economy as something that is both promoting inequality and also hindering productivity. So where am I wrong?
First of all, I didn't say there's no places, and I'm not positive what I think of that area. You didn't say the following, but I had a student that came to me 2 years ago in the policy school, the Kennedy School, who wanted to do a thesis, and his thesis was going to be that private equity was hurting companies' profits because they were firing too many people, and if they didn't fire as many people, they'd make more profits. And I told the student, I sort of respect your view on firing people, but it just can't be the case that every mistake a company makes for its bottom line is doing things that are insufficiently in accord with your values, and that if they did, better things for climate, better things for people, that would always increase their profits. So sort of, but you might grant that and say the companies are increasing their profits, they're just increasing it at the expense of some other goal. So the sort of all good things go together version is like whatever it is you like, if companies did that, their profits would go up and the world would be better, and they're all making a mistake in the direction you wish. I'm very skeptical of that. Some profits come from rent-seeking. I think there's a lot of rent-seeking in the financial sector. I think getting rid of rent-seeking generally is a way to make an economy that's more equal and more efficient. And so, having more competition, for example, is one way to reduce those rents, and might go along the lines of what you just said. But I think in other cases there is a trade-off, and I think fundamentally I agree with Milton Friedman about what companies should do, and then I disagree with Milton Friedman because I think they need to be regulated and taxed so that when they do those things, when they maximize their profits, they're doing it in a way that also reduces carbon emissions or, it ensures no one is paid less than, a minimum wage and the like. So I think I'm sort of willing to impose and some point with those taxes and regulations, probably a bit of a trade-off, because just getting rid of the rents won't be enough to make the world I would want, or I suspect you would want. Thank you.